Britain's most celebrated palace rises from the Oxfordshire landscape with effortless authority, its stone mass signaling victory, permanence, and national pride. Yet behind the facade, the question lingers like a draft through a long gallery. Who really paid for this? Blenheim Palace was conceived not as a home, but as a monument, commissioned in the aftermath of the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, a decisive victory in the War of the Spanish Succession. The triumph was framed as salvation for Europe, a blow against French dominance, and the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, was elevated as the indispensable hero. What followed was not merely architecture, but propaganda rendered in stone. The palace was intended to speak before anyone entered it. Its scale was deliberate. Its cost was staggering. Parliament authorized funds as a national reward, and Queen Anne formally granted the land and the promise of construction. But the gesture came with conditions, rivalries, and an unstable political foundation. This was a gift tied to continued favor, to military usefulness, and to obedience within a volatile court. Stand in the great court and consider the logistics alone. Thousands of tons of stone quarried and transported. Armies of craftsmen paid weekly. An administrative machine running continuously just to keep the site alive. This was not private wealth at work. It was public money, filtered through politics. As the walls rose, so did resentment. Marlborough's enemies multiplied, particularly among those who viewed his power as unchecked and his victories as self-serving. His wife, Sarah Churchill, once the Queen's closest confidant, fell spectacularly from favor, and with that fall came financial retaliation. Funds were delayed, questioned, and in some cases, quietly withdrawn. The building site did not stop. It could not. Contracts had been signed. Laborers depended on wages. The machinery of luxury once started demanded constant feeding. Debt seeped in through every corridor. The Duke advanced personal funds, borrowed heavily, and masked shortfalls through complex arrangements that blurred public and private accounts. The numbers were never clean. Parliamentary audits loomed. Accusations of embezzlement circulated, not always spoken aloud, but understood. Step past the showpiece rooms and imagine the ledgers behind them. Columns of figures tracking stone, timber, iron, and labor, all while political support eroded. This was a palace built under siege, not from foreign armies, from shifting loyalties. When Marlborough was finally dismissed from command and briefly exiled, the bill came due. Construction slowed. Workers were dismissed. Sections of the palace stood unfinished, grand shells without interiors, monuments to ambition interrupted. What the visitor sees today as harmonious grandeur was once a site of financial panic and moral compromise. The glory of victory masked the exploitation beneath. Taxpayers funding a private dynasty, laborers paid late or not at all, and a nation sold a story of triumph while the cost is quietly absorbed elsewhere. Blenheim survives because the myth endured. Victory justified excess. Stone concealed debt. Power, without a crown, built a house that became a machine, grinding wealth, labor, and reputation into permanence. The palace stands, immaculate and admired. But its origins ask an uncomfortable question that still echoes off its walls. When beauty is this expensive, who is meant to forget the price? Which house should we investigate next? Behind the facade of Blenheim, the most consequential battle was not fought on a field, but within a marriage. John and Sarah Churchill arrived at power bound by shared ambition. Yet the palace they shaped became an amplifier of conflict rather than refuge. Their union, forged in the late 17th century, was initially pragmatic and effective. Sarah managed household's correspondence, patronage with near-military discipline, while John advanced through command and court favor. Together, they operated as a single political organism. But a house of this scale does not merely reflect its owners. It magnifies them. Stand in the long galleries and consider the rhythm of daily life here. Dozens of servants moving on schedules dictated by hierarchy and silence, accounts delivered weekly, decisions scrutinized by rivals outside the gates. Within that pressure, Intimacy eroded. Letters between the couple reveal a steady shift from partnership to resentment, from trust to surveillance. Sarah controlled access to her husband, filtered information, and increasingly dictated policy within the household. What began as efficiency hardened into dominance. John, often absent on campaign or at court, withdrew rather than confronted. Distance became routine. The palace itself reinforced the imbalance. Vast rooms separated daily life into zones of command and service, presence and absence. Step past the showpiece rooms and into the private apartments, where disputes played out, not in public scandal, but in cold formality. Separate finances, separate allies, separate agendas. Sarah's influence over Queen Anne had once shielded the family from consequence. But when that bond fractured, the marriage lost its greatest external support. Sarah's exile from court was mirrored by her emotional isolation at home, and she responded by tightening control where she still could. Money became a weapon. Construction costs, delayed payments, and mounting debts sharpened every disagreement. Sarah accused John of weakness and accommodation. John accused Sarah of recklessness and provocation. Neither accusation was unfounded. The machinery of luxury demanded unity at the top. Instead, it exposed fractures. Servants noticed. Clerks recorded changes in instruction. Decisions were countermanded. The household became a site of quiet resistance, where loyalty splintered along personal lines. This was not a marriage undone by passion, but by power. Power measured in access, in letters intercepted, in rooms denied. The palace did not cause the conflict, but it institutionalized it. Blenheim required constant management, and Sarah's relentless oversight filled the vacuum left by John's absence. Yet the more she controlled, the more she alienated allies, including her husband. When John fell from favor and left England, the distance became physical. When he returned, it remained structural. What they do not show in the polished rooms today is the emotional cost of maintaining authority on this scale. Blenheim demanded certainty, and the marriage supplied only strain. Love, if it remained, was subordinated to survival. The palace endured. The partnership did not. What stands as a monument to collaboration turned corrosive, to a legacy with a price paid privately and publicly. Behind the grandeur lies a quieter question, etched into the stone by years of tension. How much intimacy can survive inside a house built to dominate? Which house should we investigate next? Behind the facade of Blenheim lies a second architecture, quieter and more controlled, built not for display, but for containment. This palace was designed with circulation in mind: who moves where, who sees whom, and who does not. Architects John Van Brugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor embedded hierarchy into the plan itself. With service corridors threading invisibly behind staterooms, staircases concealed within walls, and doors positioned to regulate access with precision. Stand in the main apartments, and the grandeur feels effortless. Step past the showpiece rooms, and the building changes character. Narrow passages, low ceilings, roots intended to be forgotten. These hidden corridors were not decorative flourishes. They were operational infrastructure. Servants could cross entire wings without being seen. Messages could be delivered without witnesses. Sensitive conversations could take place beyond the ceremonial axis of the house. In a palace saturated with political tension, privacy was currency. Blenheim was not simply inhabited. It was managed, and management required secrecy. That secrecy extended to paper. The early decades of Blenheim generated a vast volume of correspondence, military dispatches, financial accounts, private letters, and politically sensitive memoranda. Some survive. Many do not. Gaps in the archival record are conspicuous, particularly from periods of conflict between the Marlboroughs and the Crown. Entire sequences of letters, referenced and surviving replies, are missing. Accounts list payments without explanation. Decisions appear finalized with no trace of debate. Historians are left to reconstruct intent from absence. The destruction of documents was not unusual in the early 18th century, but at Blenheim, it carried higher stakes. Paper was evidence. Evidence of overspending, of political maneuvering, of promises made and broken. When John Churchill fell from favor, the risk was not merely personal disgrace but formal investigation. The quiet disappearance of records protected reputations on all sides. What they do not show in the public narrative is how carefully the past was edited to preserve stability. Royal involvement complicates the picture further. Queen Anne's support for Blenheim was never unconditional, and her withdrawal of favor coincided with increased scrutiny of the project. Yet no full reckoning followed. No comprehensive audit was ever completed. The reasons lie partly in mutual vulnerability. Exposing Marlborough's excesses risked exposing royal complicity. Silence served everyone with power. The cover-up, if it can be called that, was structural rather than dramatic. Built into the way information was stored, withheld, or quietly removed. Walk through the palace today, and the rooms appear complete, coherent, resolved. But behind the walls, unanswered questions remain. Which agreements were honored only on paper? Which debts were quietly forgiven? Which actions were deemed too destabilizing to record? Blenheim is celebrated as a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, yet it is also a masterclass in controlled memory. A house that became a machine, not only for living, but for forgetting. The hidden corridors still exist. The missing papers do not. Between them lies a silence that has shaped how this palace is understood for 3 centuries. Behind the grandeur, behind the guided tours, the unanswered question persists, as quietly as footsteps in a service passage. What was removed to keep this story intact, and who decided it was safer not to know? Which house should we investigate next? Blenheim's 20th century relevance did not arrive quietly. It arrived through war, bureaucracy, and a child born into circumstance rather than choice. In 1874, Winston Churchill entered the world here, not in a ceremonial chamber, but in a modest bedroom adapted for convenience. His birth anchored Blenheim to modern political memory, yet the palace shaped him long before history returned him to it. This was a house saturated with inherited authority, where corridors carried stories of command, retreat, and survival. Power was not abstract here. It was architectural. Stand in the hall and consider what it meant to grow up in a space built to celebrate victory. Churchill absorbed its scale early, the language of grandeur embedded in stone and procession. Yet by the time he reached adulthood, Blenheim was no longer secure. Financial instability shadowed the estate, and its future was uncertain. That tension between legacy and fragility would become familiar. When war returned to Europe in 1914, the palace entered a new phase. No longer a symbol of conquest, but a resource to be managed under pressure. During both World Wars, Blenheim's role shifted from display to function. Its remoteness, size, and infrastructure made it suitable for controlled use. Portions of the estate were requisitioned. Staff routines adapted to blackout regulations and rationing. Administrative rooms replaced drawing rooms in importance. This was not a frontline site, but it was folded into the national effort, quietly and without ceremony. The machinery of luxury slowed, then recalibrated. Survival replaced spectacle. Churchill's connection to Blenheim deepened during the Second World War, though not always physically. The palace stood as a psychological landmark, a reminder of continuity amid collapse. Its very existence suggested endurance, even as Britain faced invasion threats, bomb damage, and financial exhaustion. Intelligence work, wartime planning, and political consultation occurred across country houses like this, chosen for discretion as much as capacity. Blenheim's thick walls and controlled access were assets. Hidden corridors once used for servants now served privacy of a different kind. Step past the showpiece rooms and imagine maps spread across tables. Schedules recalculated under wartime constraints. Staff operating with reduced numbers and heightened vigilance. This was architecture under stress. Maintenance deferred. Repairs postponed. The cost of keeping it alive during war years was not merely financial, but strategic. Every decision balanced preservation against necessity. Nothing was guaranteed. After 1945, Churchill's myth expanded, and Blenheim absorbed part of it. The palace became tethered to national identity through association. Its narrative streamlined to emphasize birthright and leadership. What they do not show is how selective that memory is. The war strained Blenheim as much as they elevated it symbolically. Resources were consumed. Deferred decay accumulated. The estate emerged intact but altered. Blenheim's 20th century survival was not inevitable. It endured through adaptation, through quiet service, and through the symbolic weight carried by one of its sons. Behind the facade, the lesson remains intact. Architecture does not merely witness history, it participates in it, absorbing pressure, bending purpose, and waiting for stability to return. The palace stands today not as a frozen monument, but as evidence of how power, war, and memory reshape space over time. And the question lingers in the stillness left behind. How much of what we honor was preserved by necessity rather than choice? Which house should we investigate next? Power gathered at Blenheim did not sit quietly. It pressed outward, shaping rooms, relationships, and reputations. From the moment construction began, the palace functioned less as a residence than as a political instrument, a stage on which loyalty and betrayal played out in full view of the court. John Churchill's military success had given him influence that rivaled ministers and unnerved monarchs. Blenheim was designed to embody that authority, its scale signaling permanence, its axial planning enforcing hierarchy. But power of that magnitude, especially when it lacks a crown, invites scrutiny. And scrutiny at court turns quickly into resentment. Stand in the Great Hall and imagine it not as a ceremonial space, but as a provocation. Every column, every carved trophy of war reinforced the Duke's dominance. For allies, it was reassurance. For rivals, it was intolerable. The palace rose during a period of intense factionalism, when Whigs and Tories battled for control of Parliament and the Queen's favor. Marlborough's alliances were strategic, not sentimental, and as military necessity waned, so did political patience. What had once been celebrated as national service began to look, to some, like personal aggrandizement paid for by the state. At the center of this tension stood Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, whose influence matched her husband's ambition. She controlled access, correspondence, and domestic operations with precision, overseeing staff, finances, and schedules. Her closeness to Queen Anne was once absolute. Private letters show an intimacy that blurred the line between friendship and governance. But intimacy at court is fragile. Disagreements hardened, trust eroded. Sarah's bluntness, once tolerated, became a liability. When the Queen turned away, it was not merely a social slight. It was a political verdict. Consequences were immediate and material. Funding slowed. Oversight increased. Marlborough's enemies seized the moment, questioning expenses, reopening contracts, and reframing earlier approvals as excess. Step past the showpiece rooms and into the administrative corridors where clerks tracked payments and delays, where wages were recalculated and suppliers pressed for settlement. This was how betrayal manifested, not in dramatic arrests, but in withheld signatures and stalled accounts. The machinery of luxury depends on steady power. Interrupt it, and the structure begins to strain. Marlborough's fall from favor culminated in his dismissal in 1711, followed by exile. The palace, mid-construction, became collateral damage in a broader purge. Work halted, skilled craftsmen dispersed. The political message was unmistakable. Blenheim was no longer a reward. It was evidence. Evidence of how quickly admiration curdles when influence grows too visible. The Duke had commanded armies. He could not command the court. What survives today is stone, carefully restored and presented as continuity. What they do not show is how precarious it once was. How pride and power made the palace vulnerable to the very system that created it. Blenheim's grandeur conceals a lesson written into its walls. Authority borrowed from politics is always temporary. And when it is withdrawn, even the largest house can be left exposed. Legacy with a price lingers here, asking quietly who controlled whom and who paid when loyalty finally broke. Which house should we investigate next? Behind the facade of Blenheim, grandeur depended on an army that history rarely names. The palace did not function through marble and ideology alone. It required bodies, routines, and silence. From the earliest years of construction through its occupation, hundreds of servants, laborers, and tradespeople sustained the house. Each assigned a role carefully calibrated to preserve hierarchy. Stonecutters, masons, and carters built it. Afterward came footmen, housemaids, laundresses, grooms, scullery workers, gardeners, and clerks. Their presence was constant. Their visibility was not. Step past the showpiece rooms, and the building narrows. Corridors tighten. Staircases steepen. These were the roots of labor, designed to move unseen hands efficiently through the house, without disturbing those above. A footman could cross an entire wing without entering a single ceremonial space. A maid could clean, replace linens, and withdraw before dawn. This was not accidental. Architecture enforced silence. Blenheim was a house that became a machine, and the people inside it were components expected to function without friction. Records that survive show rigid schedules and long hours. Servants rose before daylight and worked until late evening, 7 days a week. Wages were modest and often delayed during periods of financial strain. Dismissal could be immediate. Injury meant replacement. There was no safety net. The cost of keeping it alive was absorbed at the lowest levels first. When funds tightened, staff numbers were reduced, workloads increased, and corners quietly cut. The bill came due, and it was paid in exhaustion. What they do not show in official histories are the consequences of this imbalance. Servants lived under constant surveillance, governed by strict codes of behavior. Privacy was minimal. Infractions were recorded. Punishments ranged from docked pay to expulsion without reference. Some disappeared from records entirely, leaving no trace beyond a crossed-out name in an account book. These were not scandals worth preserving. Silence was the system. The moral tension is embedded in the building itself. Blenheim's beauty required relentless upkeep. Fires tended around the clock. Candles replaced nightly. Floors scrubbed. Horses fed. Gardens maintained across hundreds of acres. Every visible surface depended on invisible labor. Stand in the hall and look upward. The ceiling tells a story of victory. The floor beneath it carries the weight of those who maintained it. This was not cruelty by exception, but by design. The aristocratic household was structured to extract service efficiently, normalizing disparity through routine. Power without a crown still demanded obedience, and architecture helped secure it. The servants were essential and expendable at once. Their lives sustained a legacy that did not include them. Blenheim endures as a triumph of design and ambition. But behind the facade, behind the guided routes and polished narratives, lies another truth. A palace this large does not stand alone. It stands on unseen hands, disciplined bodies, and lives spent maintaining someone else's permanence. The house survives. Their stories do not. And the quiet question lingers in every service corridor left intact: who really paid for this? Which house should we investigate next? Beneath Blenheim's grandeur, the walls carry a quieter, darker memory. Stories circulate of rooms unvisited, corridors avoided, and shadows that seem to linger longer than light allows. Ghosts of the past, whispered by servants and chroniclers alike, are not mere superstition. Here they are echoes of lives lived under relentless pressure. Deaths, accidents, and sudden illnesses punctuated the palace's history, leaving traces in ledgers, letters, and diaries that survive only partially. Stand in the hall and imagine the air thick with anticipation and anxiety, a space that has borne witness to triumph and tragedy alike. Step past the showpiece rooms and into the hidden chambers where domestic staff slept in cramped quarters above kitchens and laundries. Illnesses spread quickly through these densely populated spaces. Records indicate typhoid, influenza, and other epidemics claimed several lives in a single season. Servants often disappeared from rosters without explanation. Their deaths were noted in passing, rarely memorialized, but their absence left operational gaps. The machinery of luxury depended on their labor, and yet the human cost remained invisible. A house this vast demanded uninterrupted function, and when workers succumbed, it adapted without pause. The family, too, was not untouched by misfortune. Children died young. Visitors fell victim to accidents on grand staircases or while traversing slippery terraces. In some instances, correspondence alludes to sudden mental collapse, intense anxiety, and the psychological toll of life within walls that could inspire both awe and terror. Blenheim was designed to impress, but it could also intimidate, suffocate, and isolate. Its scale amplified the consequences of error, turning minor mistakes into crises, and private grief into institutional inconvenience. Stories of hauntings, once dismissed, gain a different dimension when examined alongside these facts. The so-called ghosts of Blenheim are often tied to real events: a chamber unused after a tragic death, a corridor avoided because a servant once fell, a wing closed following structural failure. The palace records hint at a culture of remembrance through avoidance, of memory encoded in absence. What they do not show in public tours is the way tragedy influenced architecture itself. Staircases moved, doors sealed, and access rerouted to accommodate both living and dead beyond the physical. There is the psychological imprint. Generations of the Marlborough family grew up in a house that demanded vigilance, control, and endurance. Emotional strain became habitual, anxiety woven into daily rhythms. Stand in the drawing rooms and feel the duality, a place built for celebration, yet continuously shadowed by the precariousness of life within it. The palace preserved history in stone, but also preserved trauma in subtle, enduring ways. Blenheim's grandeur survives, and with it, the quiet testimony of suffering and loss. The visible beauty masks the cost paid by unseen hands, by fragile bodies, and by the emotional toll of centuries. It is a house that became a machine, not just for display, but for endurance under pressure. And as we walk its halls, we are left with the lingering question: what is the cost of perfection, and whose lives are measured in its preservation? Which house should we investigate next? Blenheim was conceived to impress, to dominate, and to overwhelm every visitor who approached its gates. From the moment the carriage rounded the estate's sweeping drive, the scale was meant to signal authority. Step past the showpiece rooms and into the galleries, and the effect is magnified. Ceilings soar over 20 feet, walls stretch unbroken, and the eye is drawn along axes that enforce perspective and hierarchy. Every element, from the placement of statues to the pattern of windows, was calculated to convey power. The palace did not merely accommodate the Marlboroughs. It commanded attention. It communicated that authority could exist in stone, in space, in the choreography of human movement. The architecture itself functioned as a tool of psychological control. Visitors were guided through corridors that alternated between compression and expansion, staircases that demanded pause, and halls that emphasized subordination or prominence depending on rank. Servants moved invisibly, while the elite passed under ceilings emblazoned with allegorical triumphs. Blenheim's Baroque design created awe, but also a subtle intimidation. Stand in the central hall and sense it. The house measures not only bodies, but obedience. Controlling experience as rigorously as the Duke controlled his household, the exterior reinforced the interior's message. Massive facades, symmetrical wings, and precise landscaping amplified the impression of permanence. The ornamental gardens, extending over hundreds of acres, functioned as an extension of the palace, drawing attention outward while simultaneously emphasizing the controlled hierarchy of nature imposed by design. Water features, vistas, and terraces were not simply decorative. They were instruments of perception, regulating what could be seen and from where. Visitors experienced the estate as a sequence of orchestrated revelations, each more imposing than the last. Behind this grandeur, the machinery of construction and maintenance operated continuously. Hundreds of craftsmen labored on masonry, plaster, and woodwork, often under conditions of intense scrutiny and pressure. Stones had to be cut to precise measurements, ceilings painted in elaborate frescoes, and ironwork forged to exacting standards. Wages, supply chains, and schedules required constant oversight. Any delay, any imperfection, would compromise the visual and psychological effect. Power was embedded in execution as much as in design. Yet this architecture came at a cost. The financial burden of sustaining such scale was relentless. Roof repairs, heating vast halls, and maintaining gardens demanded resources that sometimes exceeded income. Debts mounted. And later generations of dukes had to negotiate complex financial arrangements to prevent sections from falling into disrepair. The very qualities that impressed also endangered. A palace built to awe became a palace that consumed its permanence contingent on continuous labor and capital. Blenheim's success as a statement of authority illustrates a broader principle. Architecture can enforce power silently. Every axis, gallery, and window functions as part of a larger system, shaping perception, social order, and behavior. The palace does more than house people. It orchestrates them. Its grandeur and intimidation coexist, demonstrating that beauty can also be a form of control. And that scale is as much a weapon as a symbol. The house stands as a testament to deliberate manipulation of space, leaving visitors to wonder quietly how much of what awes is engineered, and who ultimately pays for the illusion of power. Which house should we investigate next? By the late 19th century, Blenheim no longer symbolized triumph. It symbolized survival. The palace remained vast, immovable, and expensive, but the system that once sustained it was failing. Agricultural rents declined after the 1870s, taxes increased, and inherited wealth fractured under modern economics. The Dukes of Marlborough possessed land and prestige, but liquidity vanished. A house designed to project permanence now hemorrhaged money simply by existing. Roofs leaked. Stone decayed. Staff numbers shrank. The cost of keeping it alive no longer matched the income meant to sustain it. Stand in the hall and imagine it colder, darker, partially closed. Entire wings were shuttered to save fuel. Fires were limited to occupied rooms. Servants were dismissed not for incompetence but for arithmetic. Ledgers from the period show mounting deficits and the steady liquidation of assets. Paintings sold. Furniture auctioned. Family silver quietly removed. What they do not show in the tourist narrative is how close Blenheim came to becoming an architectural liability too large to carry forward. By the 1890s, the situation had become critical. The ninth Duke inherited a palace burdened with debt and a title stripped of financial authority. Britain's aristocracy faced a reckoning. The old model had collapsed. What remained was stone without capital. Across the Atlantic, however, money was consolidating rapidly. American industrial fortunes, newly minted and socially ambitious, sought legitimacy through heritage. The transaction was not romantic. It was structural. In 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived at Blenheim as the future Duchess of Marlborough, carrying with her a dowry estimated at over $2.5 million, followed by an annual income equivalent to tens of millions today. The money stabilized the estate almost immediately. Debts were cleared. Deferred maintenance resumed. Staff numbers increased. The machinery of luxury restarted. Step past the showpiece rooms and consider what that infusion meant in practical terms. Wages paid on time. Roofs repaired. Stone cleaned. Gardens restored. The palace breathed again. The cost was personal. Consuelo did not choose Blenheim freely. Her marriage was orchestrated under pressure, a financial rescue framed as alliance. The exchange was explicit. Cash for continuity. Money for memory. The palace survived, but at a human price rarely acknowledged. This was preservation through sacrifice. A reminder that buildings endure by consuming lives as well as fortunes. Culturally, the rescue unsettled Britain. Newspapers criticized the selling of aristocracy to American money, yet few offered alternatives. Without that capital, Blenheim would likely have faced closure, partial demolition, or state seizure. Power without a crown had reached its limit. The palace required a new engine. What stands today is not merely an English monument, but a transatlantic artifact, preserved through a convergence of decline and excess. Blenheim did not endure because the old system worked. It endured because it adapted, absorbing new wealth to sustain old stone. Behind the facade, the lesson remains uncomfortably clear. Heritage survives, not on pride alone, but on whoever can afford to pay when the bill comes due. And that leaves a final question echoing through the restored corridors. When preservation depends on rescue, whose legacy is being protected, and at what cost? Which house should we investigate next? Blenheim's preservation into the 21st century is less a story of triumph than a testament to vigilance, negotiation, and adaptation. The palace, once designed to proclaim conquest and influence, now functions as both museum and home, a duality that demands constant management. Stand in the hall and consider the infrastructure behind what appears effortless. Climate control to protect frescoes, specialized staff to maintain centuries-old oak, and security systems calibrated to preserve both art and architecture. The machinery of luxury has been repurposed, but the stakes remain high. Each decision carries consequences, financial, cultural, and historical. Step past the showpiece rooms and into the offices where modern preservationists operate. They balance public access against conservation, curatorial choices against the constraints of climate, funding, and staffing. Ledgers record not only expenses but projected risks. Stonework inspection every 5 years, roof replacement schedules, and pest control measures to protect textiles and wood. It is a continuous operation, one in which failure is cumulative. The grandeur of the palace can mislead, masking the scale of effort required to sustain it. What they do not show in photographs or public tours is the unseen labor, the planning, and the unseen hands that prevent decay from reclaiming space once sculpted for power. Public tours themselves are a modern adaptation. The choreography of visitors mirrors the original design, though now for education rather than intimidation. Pathways, staircases, and galleries are managed to limit wear while conveying drama. Every footstep is monitored, every light calibrated. Even the gardens, once extensions of hierarchy and power, are maintained as living archives, carefully pruned, mapped, and documented. The estate functions as a teaching instrument, yet the tension between historical fidelity and sustainability is constant. Preservation is itself a form of control, continuation of the palace's legacy of meticulous orchestration. Financially, Blenheim is supported through a complex system. Entrance fees, events, private tours, and public grants all feed into a carefully managed budget. Staff salaries, restoration projects, insurance, and utilities compete with the imperatives of access and authenticity. Each summer brings increased pressure, each winter potential risk. Deferred maintenance from prior decades resurfaces in cracks, leaks, or woodworm infestations. The house is alive, but in a different sense than it was for the Marlboroughs. It survives because vigilance has replaced authority, and planning has replaced instinct. Yet even today, Blenheim's story retains its moral tension. It embodies beauty and achievement, but also the costs hidden behind that facade: labor, money, and historical compromise. Restoration itself raises questions about authenticity. How much intervention honors history, and how much preserves an image? Visitors experience completion, but the process behind it is endless. Every conservation effort is a negotiation between what can be saved and what must be allowed to change. Walking its halls now, one senses the continuity of control, the ongoing orchestration of space, material, and experience. Blenheim remains a house that became a machine, transformed from a monument of power into a monument of preservation. And as we contemplate its enduring presence, a question persists as sharply as it did in the 17th century: who really pays for this? And what is the true cost of maintaining a legacy beyond a lifetime? Which house should we investigate next?